Well, good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank Reverend Bob for inviting me back to Sacramento. I always enjoy being able to come up, and I'm not a very good speaker, and so I feel like Bob, he over the years that he's been here at Sacramento, he's invited me every 2 or 3 years, and I kind of think like he's inviting me just because I'm a good friend and not necessarily a very good speaker or anything. But at any rate, I'm always happy to be here, and I've made some wonderful friends here as well. The last time I was here was 2 years ago, actually at the same service, the Eitaikyo service. And I have to say though that I am sorry that Rinban Oshita will be retiring next year. As he mentioned, we've been best friends since our days in Kyoto back in the early 70s. And we started together in 1975 as ministers. And he really, is one of the finest ministers that I've ever met. And so I would have liked to have him I would have liked to see him continue at least for another 3 years. But part of the reason why is because I envy him for the opportunity to be able to retire at a time when he's still, in good health and able to enjoy his life. I don't see retirement in my life for another at least 3 years, if not more. Both of my predecessors both retired at the age of 74, so that means that I would have to keep going for another 7 years or so. I thought that I'd reflect back on some of the great experiences that we had back in those days in Kyoto, and then another 4 years living together in Los Angeles. But then I realized, we were in our 20s, our mid-20s, and I realized that I can't share most of those stories in public. So I was thinking maybe we could write about them, together and then have them released after we're both gone. As he mentioned, he talked about the motorcycle story, and it really was, the whole time we became good friends, and we, were living in Los Angeles together. He never mentioned that story, and I think it was the second time that he invited me to Sacramento. In his introduction, he told that story, and I never knew about that, and so I offered him money, but he wouldn't take it. Last time I came, I made the big mistake of assuming that the people that would be here for the service would be all children. And so I gave a really, kind of a story, a talk that was more appropriate for children. And then this time I realized, well, I should make it for adults. And then I look out, and there are a lot of children out here. And so I'm not sure that they're going to enjoy my talk very much. But at any rate, today we gather for this Eitaikyo service. And it really is the time for us to reflect back on our departed parents, our grandparents, our ancestors, also our Dharma friends that were part of this temple this temple has a history of over 100 years. And at every memorial service we have, I think about how it is that they give us the opportunity, the chance to gather here at this temple, and to have this opportunity to listen to the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. Their presence is continually felt because we have this temple at where we can listen to the teachings. When I think about the activities that we have at our temples, one role that it serves is as a kind of a community center where we have gatherings of all different kinds of things. Here at Sacramento, I know that you have a huge Dharma school, you have scouts, you have basketball. In addition, I think many other things that go on at the temple. And in our temple in Los Angeles, we have things like taiko, we have like Japanese classical dance, we even have yoga and Zumba classes nowadays. And we also maintain our preschool, which has been in existence for nearly 40 years. But one of the original terms for referring to our Jodo Shinshu temples was Nembutsu Dojo, Well, you all know what Nembutsu is, and dojo, you've probably heard, that term, especially associated to martial arts. So a place to practice a path like judo or kendo, and then also the Buddha Dharma. We say dojo, a place to start on the path. And so Nembutsu Dojo, the original temples that followed the teachings of Shinran, were places solely, for listening to the teaching of the Nembutsu. Today I thought that I would share with you a couple of, one really, moving experience that I had earlier this year. I was given the opportunity to participate in a conference at the Vatican in Rome. And during the 4 decades that I've been serving as a minister, I've basically tried to quietly share my understanding, my appreciation of the Buddhist teachings with our members and with anyone who comes to the temple to listen. But I've always felt that the teachings of the Buddha provide an alternative way of looking at life here in the United States now in the 21st century. And I was always kind of wishing that there was some way that I could go out and share the teachings with people who don't come to the temple. I think that Sacramento has been a trailblazer in that area with your really strong ministerial assistant program and so forth, all of the classes and the seminars that you have. But generally speaking, Buddhism has always been a tradition that respects the teachings of other religious traditions and has never really gone out to proselytize or to try to convert people, going to different countries and trying to convert people to Buddhism. And we have, therefore, basically, simply tried to keep our doors open and hope that newcomers will join us at our services and our educational programs. And I think here, you've been really successful in doing that. This temple is not only for the Japanese American Buddhist community, but it's for all people, and it welcomes everyone that comes into the door. At any rate, I was surprised early this year to receive 2 invitations and to participate in 2 conferences in which we Buddhists were invited to share our tradition outside of our temples. And the first one was in May at a conference that was held at the White House. About 125 Buddhist representatives met with the members of President Obama's administration to share our perspectives on such timely issues as global warming, racial injustice, freedom of religion, and war and peace. And statements were signed by all of the participants and sent to the president on 2 issues: global warming, our attitudes on nature, the teaching of interdependence, and then also racial injustice, respect for all human life, for all life. It was really an incredible experience being at the White House and meeting some of the leaders of the administration, but it was too bad that President Obama was too busy to meet with us. And then the second trip that I had was to go to Rome to participate in a 5-day conference at the Vatican. And this time it was a smaller group, 25 Buddhists and 20 Catholic leaders from the United States met with Vatican priests on the theme suffering, liberation, and fraternity. And there were also 3 other Jodo Shinshu ministers that were invited, Reverend Ron Kobata of San Francisco, Reverend Ron Miyamura of the Midwest Buddhist Temple, and Patty Nakai of our Buddhist Temple of Chicago. And all of us were chosen because we had some experience in Buddhist Catholic dialogue. The highlight was our opportunity to meet one by one with Pope Francis to exchange greetings and to shake hands. And he is, really such a nice person. I mean, he was here in the United States, and I think all of you saw some of the scenes, some of the news footage of his visit here. He's very humble, and as you know, so concerned about what we human beings are doing to destroy our home, Mother Earth, and of how much suffering there is, especially among the poor, the powerless, those living in areas subject to terrorism and war. I think many of you had that opportunity to learn more about the Pope during his recent trip to the United States. And Pope Francis has not only invigorated the Catholic Church, but he's made huge contributions in getting the world to look at all of the problems that we face, whether it's global warming, whether it's the gap between the rich and poor, homelessness, war, oppression, and so forth. And I remember, we were one day, there was a 5-day conference, and one day we had a kind of a private tour of the Vatican, and we had a private audience with the Pope. And, he spoke for about 5 minutes to us, when we were there. And he talked about, the problems that I just described. And when he got onto the subject of homelessness, all of a sudden, a vision came into my mind, and our temple is in downtown Los Angeles, and it's not that far from Skid Row, and so we do have homeless, people, unfortunately, living very close to our temple. And on some days, like on a Sunday, you could stand in our balcony, and you could look out to the street right in front, and you can see tents, with people living there. And as he was talking about this, all of a sudden I had this image, and I thought to myself, the temple coexists with these people, but there's nothing really that we've done to help them. And and so this kind of a sense of what do you call it? A little bit of shame, because what we tend to do, in our temples, at our board meetings and so forth, is to talk about how to protect ourselves, and not really to help, those people who are suffering out there. So that, that kind of thing has enabled our temple to start meeting with other Catholic leaders, to think about ways in which we can help, the problem of, homelessness and mental, illness and so forth, right in our own community. In June, when the conference was held, he was so happy. Pope Francis was so happy to know that Buddhists and Catholics were there to share ideas of how we can find a more proper way to live, for a more proper way for people to live together in harmony in this world. And so we heard that it was he himself who had said that he wanted to greet us individually. And the conference itself was held, at this beautiful location called Castel Gandolfo, the site of the Pope's summer residence. It's been there probably for centuries. It's and then also a beautiful retreat center where we stayed and we convened. And the conference itself was quite intensive. Every morning we started with Buddhist morning service at 7 o'clock, and then there was a Catholic Mass after that. We had breakfast, and then from 9 o'clock, we'd start the first session. And there were like almost 50 people, and so almost each one of them, each one of us gave a talk, or we served as moderators, we served as to lead services and so forth. And so we must have listened to something like 30 lectures and, the subsequent discussions going on until about 8 or 9 p.m. every day. And we explored, Catholic views on suffering, on the paths to liberation, and at the end, how we can continue to work together to resolve these major issues that prevent us from living in peace and harmony. I'd like to see. Well, this was, the first ever Buddhist Catholic dialogue conference that was held at the Vatican, and it was interesting that the theme that was proposed is suffering, liberation, and fraternity. And one of the interesting sidelights was that the American women who were there, including Reverend Nakai, really kind of expressed their displeasure with the term fraternity, because it kind of has this, at least in English, at least in the United States, it has this male kind of flavor to it. And they said, can't you use a different word like community or, kinship or something like that? And so then the Vatican people, they pointed out that in Spanish, actually fraternity is written la fraternidad. And it's a la, so it's a feminine, word before the word fraternity. And that, in most of the world, except for maybe the United States, it doesn't have like this gender-specific feeling. But then the American women were very kind of upset, of using that word fraternity. But these are the kinds of things that the Pope has said. He said, fraternity is an essential human quality for we are all relational beings. A lively awareness of our relatedness helps us to look upon and treat each other as a true sister or brother. Without fraternity, it is impossible to build a just society and a solid and lasting peace. This was a message that he gave in 2014. And then lately, every year on the season of Vesak, which other Buddhist communities celebrate, observing the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and his passing. And so that the Pope has been giving a message to the Buddhist world every year. And in one message commemorating Vesak Day, he said, "You are all convinced that the root of evil is the ignorance and delusion born of greed and hatred, which in turn destroys the bonds of fraternity. As Buddhists and Christians, we live in a world all too often torn apart by oppression, selfishness, tribalism, ethnic rivalry, violence, and religious fundamentalism, a world where the other is treated as an inferior, a non-person, or someone to be feared and eliminated if possible." Pope Francis, at least in these words, seems to be using the same language of Buddhism. Those words could and have in different ways come from the Buddha. So the root of all evil is ignorance and delusion, brought about by greed and hatred. This is what, most of you probably have heard of the teaching of the three poisons, the afflictions that every human being has prevents us from, living truly happy and truly meaningful lives. And basically in Buddhism, we say the three poisons are anger, greed, and ignorance. My roommate at the conference was Reverend Ron Kobata, and he won fans over when he talked about the three poisons. And he uses, you've heard others use, instead of using greed, anger, and ignorance, we say greed, anger, and stupidity. And this is easier for us to remember because greed, anger, and stupidity, if you take the first letter, it spells gas. And so we're all afflicted with gas, But at any rate, and then, Pope Francis's words, "We are called to cooperation with other pilgrims and with people of goodwill to respect and defend our shared humanity, drawing upon different religious convictions, to be outspoken in denouncing all those social ills which damage fraternity, to be healers who enable others to grow in selfless generosity, and to be reconcilers who break down the walls of division and foster genuine brotherhood between individuals and groups in society. Our world today is witnessing a growing sense of our common humanity and a global quest for a more just, peaceful, and fraternal world. Indeed, each one of us is called upon to be an artisan of peace, by uniting and not dividing, by extinguishing hatred and not holding on to it, by opening paths to dialogue and not by constructing new walls. Let us dialogue and meet each other in order to establish a culture of dialogue in the world, a culture of encounter. I would say that as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, I would have to say that those goals that the Pope presents are much too kind of like lofty, for us to able to reach. But it is, I think, the exact same teaching as what we simply call the interdependence of life, or dependent origination. Everything is connected to everything else. Everyone is connected to everyone else. This is what we mean when we talk about interdependence. And it's through that teaching, that realization, that we come to understand that in that interconnectedness, that we should bond with and harmonize with all living things, and that we do that, and that we do what we can to slow down, the rapid destruction to Mother Earth, and work towards its recovery. In his recent, in his encyclical that he gave, I think it was like in early June, he talked about, he said, we must make immediate changes in how we live to fight global warming and save the environment. Tragically, people have grown increasingly self-obsessed, ever more distant from nature, and alarmingly preoccupied with technological novelty. This is where, I thought he was talking to me, because as obsessed as I am with all of my technological gadgets, my MacBook, my iPhone, and so forth, but I was reassured to see that almost every Catholic father and every Buddhist monk had either an iPhone or a huge Android. And then I was happy, when we went to the audience, we were instructed to put away all of our phones and cameras before Pope Francis walked in. But one last quote from Pope Francis, and you can see that I've become quite a fan. I'm sure, that we can't agree with everything he says. We can't agree with everything that the Catholic Church represents, but I am very happy and thankful for the leadership role that he's taking. And this is one of the things that I was able to say to him when I had that opportunity to meet him. The last quote is, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." I think that in these ways there is commonality in the teachings of the Catholic and Buddhist traditions. Of course there are differences, but the goal of working towards peace and harmony are the same. Of finding meaning and happiness in our lives, they are, I believe, the same wishes that those whom we honor at this Eitaikyo service have for us as well. Eitaikyo really is that time to reflect back on our ancestors, to think about the wishes that they have for us. My grandparents were born, in the late 1800s, way before cars and airplanes, TVs, and cell phones. And if they could see the world today, I think that they would be surprised and possibly appalled by what they see. A much more modern world with so many technological advancements, but we've lost the ability to respect and to appreciate people and the nature that we live with. I'd like to share with you, I'd like to end by sharing with you a poem that I was reminded of, one that I tried to translate from the original Japanese years ago called Itsukara, which means since when, written by the poet Michio Mado. It goes like this. When did we start hating the ground that we walk on? Not only do we wear shoes, but even socks, and curse whenever even a smudge of dirt soils our feet. When did we start hating water? We put on our raincoats and carry umbrellas, and even put on rubber galoshes, and shudder whenever even a drop of rain gets on our body. When did we start hating the sun and the air? Not only do we don underwear and pants and shirts to cover ourselves, and even a hat to protect our head. Heaven forbid if we should be exposed to the sun and the air. When did it happen that we got to despise the earth, the water, the sun, and the air? True happiness will never come to us, so busy hiding from the nature that surrounds us. I know that my talk today wasn't very appropriate for children, but at any rate, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Even though Reverend Bob's going to be gone next year, I hope that sometime way off in the future I'll be able to come back to Sacramento and meet with all of you again. Thank you so much.